Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin. Good to see you again. Thank you for
Hi,
joining us
Nasim.
from Doha, of all places.
That's right. And it's always a pleasure to be with you every week to discuss the latest developments.
Likewise, and a lot has been happening. And of course, we will be speaking a lot about what's happening in Lebanon, and that's a moving situation. So this recording is this show is being recorded on Sunday. So by the time it goes out, much of what we say will have changed. But nevertheless, we will be speaking about Lebanon, focusing on Israel using booby-trapped pages to carry out strikes against Hezbollah and Hezbollah's retaliation over the last couple of especially Saturday night and this morning. And then we'll speak more broadly about the implication of Israel's action, the mass weaponization of electric devices in this manner, and does that pose a risk to everyone with electric devices? It sounds extreme, but it sounds I'm exaggerating, but I think there is an argument that we are all less safe now. Anyone with an electric device. We'll look at the legal implications of Israel's attack, and then we'll talk about two of the other news, related matters, of course, the closure of Al Jazeera office in the West Bank by Israel, and last week's UN General Assembly resolution calling for an end to Israeli occupation within the next 12 months. But let's begin, as I mentioned, with the situation unfolding in Lebanon, when on Tuesday, thousands of pages were booby-trapped and went off, injuring hundreds, killing, I think, 30 or so, I think. So I want to just get your initial thoughts before we dive into some of the other matters.
Well, my initial thoughts is that this is indisputably a terrorist attack. What Israel did is that it basically transformed thousands of pagers and the following day hundreds of walkie-talkies into hand grenades by placing explosives within them. It remains unclear precisely how Israel managed to booby trap these devices. Most likely, it managed to infiltrate the supply chain and replace these items with items of its own that it had produced on its own, which included the explosives. And in a number of countries, Israel enjoys extraterritorial rights. So, for example, in the aftermath of the 1995, I believe it was, crash of a cargo jet in Amsterdam, it emerged that Israel, and particularly its foreign intelligence service, the Mossad, has a free run of a part of that airport. It basically enjoys extraterritorial rights there, and in that context was able to place weapons and chemicals onto that cargo plane that caused such a catastrophe in Amsterdam. Well, be that as it may, this consignment of pagers had been ordered by Hezbollah. And there's some dispute about exactly who these pagers were then delivered to for use. It appears that a number of them were indeed provided to people in Hezbollah's military chain of command and cadres, but many others were also provided to people who have some kind of association with Hezbollah civil institutions and its social welfare network. So these were provided not only, let's say, to fighters and commanders, but also to doctors and nurses and others. Now, what happened is that Israel managed to send instructions to these thousands of pagers to simultaneously detonate. And that means that some of them may have been in the personal possession of the intended victim. Others were in homes, in supermarkets, in stores, in hospitals, everywhere. And so it became really an indiscriminate terror attack. And I think I can prove that it was that, which is to say, if Hezbollah had conducted a similar attack against Israel, the entire world would be screaming bloody murder. But of course, when it's Israel doing it, the focus is on, the clinical aspects, the technical aspects, and it's celebrated as a unprecedented act of ingenuity. So these, let's call them booby traps, thousands of them went off simultaneously in southern Lebanon, in Beirut, in the Bekaa Valley, a number of them also in Syria, killing, I believe, about a dozen people, maiming many more. I think 200 were seriously to critically wounded, and several thousand others were lightly or moderately wounded. And it appears, the way these explosions operated is that a message appeared on the pager, and then several seconds later, while the person was holding the beeper to read the message, it exploded. And there appears to have been a particularly high incidence of people losing one or both eyes in these explosions. In another case, a young girl apparently grabbed the pager to give it to her father, and she was blown to bits. And so this was, the intention was literally to kill 4,000 people in the space of several seconds in areas throughout Lebanon. And I think this attack is significant for a number of reasons. The first is, of course, that it was an act of mass terror. The second is that it was intended to paralyze Hezbollah in one fell swoop. That it didn't do, but what it did do is I think it sowed doubt, chaos, confusion within Hezbollah's rank and file, because an organization which had prided itself on its military and professionalism, on its counterintelligence capabilities, on its perceived ability to withstand infiltration and penetration, all of a sudden had to face what was clearly a very carefully planned and lethal penetration. And then the next day, hundreds of walkie-talkies exploded, because they were larger and contained more explosives and ball bearings and so on, caused more deaths than on the first day. And, some were exploding in hospitals and so on. So that's kind of the immediate aspect of that. Second thing is, I think we need to place this in its broader political context, if you will, which is that Hezbollah, since the 8th of October of last year, has been engaged in what it calls a support front, which means that it has engaged, along with other members of the coalition known as the Axis of Resistance, in a multi-front war of attrition against Israel in order to continue raising the costs to Israel of continuing with its genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip, and to seek to compel it to accept a ceasefire. Israel has absolutely no intention of doing so, but was facing the growing costs of these support fronts, particularly the one in Lebanon, because much of the fighting was taking place on Israeli rather than foreign territory. And Israel appears to have taken a decision to significantly increase the pressure on Hezbollah, so that Hezbollah either essentially capitulates and puts an end to its support front, or faces increasingly severe attacks from Israel. And that we then saw at the end of last week, where Israel launched unprecedentedly severe air raids on southern Lebanon, and then also launched 4 missiles against a residential building in the southern suburbs of Beirut, where two very senior Hezbollah military commanders, and I believe about 10 or 15 others uh, were meeting in a garage 2 floors below ground level. The entire building and a number of others were flattened. Dozens of residents were killed, and Israel also managed to assassinate these two very senior Hezbollah figures and those who were with them.
You mentioned that one of the motivation here seems to be that Netanyahu is trying to raise the cost to Hezbollah of offering support to the Palestinians. They have been doing that since 8 October, launching attacks and strikes in response to the genocidal attack. It seems Hassan Nasrallah, given the way the attack has been coordinated over last night and since Israel's terrorist attack in Lebanon, that he too doesn't really want to have a full-on war. The Americans are still calling for restraint and calling on the Israelis to not escalate any further. So has Hezbollah's attack been calibrated to avoid a full military confrontation? Or is that now no longer avoidable? Because Hezbollah does possess way more weapons than the ones it's used, way more destructive weapons. It's not used those weapons. So I'm assuming Nasrallah is calibrating his response so that there isn't a full-scale war, and he still feels forced to respond to the terrorist attack. But are we now in a situation where it's now a foregone conclusion that there will now be a major confrontation between the two parties?
Well, it does seem inevitable, and it most likely will develop in that direction. But we're talking about ongoing developments, so there could always be various other factors that intervene to prevent it from exploding into a full-scale armed confrontation. Just to recap, so on Tuesday and Wednesday, we had these mass terror attacks conducted by Israel in Lebanon. And on Wednesday, the Hezbollah General Secretary Hassan Nasrallah gave a speech in which he made clear that Israel's objective is to put an end to the Lebanese support front, and that Hezbollah was committed to continuing it at all costs, irrespective of the price extracted by Israel. And this time he also mentioned the West Bank and also made clear that the tens of thousands of Israeli residents of the northern border communities who have almost a year ago now fled their communities because of the fighting in that region would not be returning so long as a genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip continues. And it was the following day that we had this strike against the Hezbollah commanders in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Nasrallah admitted that this was an unprecedented blow against his organization, and it was a very painful blow. He openly acknowledged that, but I think taking into account that Hezbollah is a very large, very well entrenched, multi-layered organization. It's not a kind of organization that is conducive to being knocked out through these kinds of attacks. And organizations like that usually, I would describe it as a very significant tactical setback that does not translate into a strategic defeat. And indeed, we have seen that on each occasion where Israel escalates its attacks on Hezbollah to seek to compel Hezbollah to cease and desist, if you will, Hezbollah tends to meet these Israeli escalations with counter escalations of its own. And indeed, what we've seen in the past 2 days is Hezbollah using larger and longer range missiles to strike deeper into Israel, now in the southern Golan Heights, in the region of south and east of Haifa. And so everything appears to be heading in the direction of a open-ended, full-scale military confrontation. And I think that serves Israel's interests, because for states and conventional armies, these kinds of prolonged wars of attrition are not to their advantage. It is to Hezbollah's advantage because, in a sense, it protects Lebanon from the most severe consequences of an all-out war where Israel has an overwhelming advantage in terms of its ability to inflict violence on Lebanon as a country, and essentially do to it what it has been doing to the Gaza Strip, even if Hezbollah can also do to Tel Aviv much of what Israel has done to Gaza, and is threatening to do to Beirut. But I think Israel has reached the point again where it's a fork in the road. Either Hezbollah capitulates, and if it doesn't, it will continue to increase the pressure on Hezbollah until it either backs off or is defeated. The problem here becomes, for Israel, kind of taking a double or nothing approach, that while Israel does have demonstrated skills at these kinds of special operations and assassinations, when it comes to military combat, and particularly ground combat, it has demonstrated, this is not the Israeli army of the 1950s and 1960s. It's on the whole, a mediocre military in such situations. Secondly, Hezbollah and other members of the Axis of Resistance coalition have also been seeking to implement the principle of what they call the unity of arenas. In other words, it's a multi-front collective war of attrition against Israel. And this brings with it the possibility that a full-scale war between Israel and Lebanon will draw in, for example, Iran. Now, on the one hand, you can make the argument that that puts Israel in a particular bind, but I think the other aspect of that is that Israel sees the remaining period of Biden's tenure in the White House as a golden, unique opportunity to provoke a direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran. So, we see developments that, on the face of it, don't appear to be in Israel's best interest, and Israel has indeed been conducting itself increasingly irrationally. But at the same time, there may well be an apocalyptic method to its madness.
Look at it from an Israeli point of view. One could argue that this is probably the worst time to open another front with Hezbollah, especially given in Gaza there is no evidence to suggest that Israel has achieved the victory it set out to achieve on 7 October. Hamas has not been destroyed, and Hamas is still fighting. There's split within the Israeli government with the security officials that they should still be focusing on Gaza and not opening up another front. And the Israeli public are very much against Netanyahu with regards to the way he's been conducting the hostage deals. There's clear, I would say, enough to suggest that Netanyahu is the one who has been torpedoing the hostage negotiations. So given it's been failing, one failure after another failure, and one could also argue that the attack, the desperate attack, or the attack on the in Lebanon last week on Tuesday with the weaponized pagers is also an act of desperation, because from what I've read, this operation has been set in motion from nearly 2 years ago. So now, if I'm a general, if I'm making the decisions, I would use those booby-trapped devices in the heat of the battle. So why now, given Israel's not achieved its goal in Gaza. It's very weak domestically, economically, on all fronts. Why open another front? So this seems to be another act of desperation.
Yes, well, here's the problem, Nasim. Just because you and I look at this situation rationally and draw certain conclusions about what would be in the best interests of the various parties, in this case Israel, doesn't mean that the party is looking at the situation rationally or reaching the same conclusions. So you said quite rightly, that when you've invested so much time and effort into this kind of spectacular terrorist attack that you can really only use once, it would be a bit like if at the outset of the June 1967 war, Israel had managed to destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground and then waited a few weeks to begin with its land invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, and thereby would have lost key elements of advantage of surprise and its advantage. So indeed, one would have expected Israel to immediately follow up these attacks with an invasion of Lebanon. Why didn't it do so? It's possible it has further tricks up its sleeve that would throw Hezbollah into even greater disarray. It's also possible that it was kind of a desperate gamble of the dice, where the impact of the attack was significantly less than was hoped, or that Israel hoped that this attack in and of itself would pressure Hezbollah and sufficiently intimidate it to reach the strategic objectives that Israel was hoping to achieve. Now, there are also other elements here that we need to take into consideration. You mentioned Netanyahu's position within Israeli public opinion and so on, which is very polarized. Well, maybe he was hoping to recoup some of his authority by successfully conducting these two attacks. Another possibility is that he felt he needed to conduct this escalation, even against the advice of some of the senior members of the security establishment, because he considered it was the best way to keep his governing coalition together. There are also splits within the security establishment where some officers are very gung-ho about going into Lebanon. Others feel that Israel first needs to reach a ceasefire agreement in Gaza so that it is not spread too thinly. So, there are all kinds of factors we can speculate about. But I would just say, just because something seems rational to you and I doesn't necessarily make it so. And even more importantly, I think one thing we can learn from the past year is never to assume that Israel's leadership behaves rationally.
Yeah, and of course, I agree with that. And we've seen throughout the past 11 months Israel driving a horse and carriage through international law. We've seen that on many fronts, carrying out a genocide, and it's under investigation by the ICJ. ICC is also seeking to open arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. But this attack, I want to ask, why is it specifically? We shouldn't need to argue this point, but what is the reason why you and I will say it's a terrorist attack? What makes it a terrorist attack? Because Israel's defenders, including many Western leaders, have said this is such an amazing targeted attack on Israel's enemies. And it seems like we need to state the obvious, because, as I said, Israel has completely undermined international law. So two things here. The question about why, from an international law point of view, why is this an act of terrorism? And secondly, just thinking ahead, I mean, with this attack, hasn't Israel made all of us the billions of people around the world with electronic devices less safe now than we were a week ago, because any tyrant, anyone can lace electronic devices with explosive and target their critics and enemies in the way Israel did with Hezbollah.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, Israel's apologists would have made excuses for this type of attack, even if it included, booby trapping baby diapers in a nursery. For them, there is nothing Israel can do that is wrong, and they will find a justification for anything and everything, as indeed they have been during the past year, and in fact for much longer. The issue here is, and again, I'm not a specialist on the finer points of international law, but indeed to take civilian objects, like phones or pagers and so on, and to transform them into explosives, and to then simultaneously blow thousands of them up without knowing specifically where they are and who is handling them, and thereby causing this, very widespread civilian casualties, is a very clear violation of international law. Or let me put it differently: it's not only a violation of international law, but even a violation of international law if Israel does it. I think that's probably the way it needs to be put. And if this is acceptable, then it is also acceptable, to rig a particular model of mobile phone or laptop or washing machine or what you will. I mean, it's a very horrifying future that the entire planet faces if these kinds of tactics are normalized, because an exception has had to be made yet again for Israel. It's, to give another example from Gaza, armed attacks on hospitals and on medical staff and on journalists and all the rest of it, things that before the 7th of October were considered beyond the pale, have now been normalized in order to accommodate Israel. And when you normalize things to accommodate Israel, you can't prevent their normalization for use by others. And it's similar, for example, if you look at these legal changes you're seeing in Western countries to suppress pro-Palestinian activism and demonstrations. Just because you change the law in order to suppress pro-Palestinian demonstrations doesn't mean that it's not then going to be used for other items on the agenda. And we've seen this in the U.S., where similar laws are now being used against, for example, activists for women's rights, or activists seeking to combat the climate crisis, and so on. So that's where the real danger lies. Both this specific form of terror warfare and the precedent it sets in terms of normalizing it for general use. And then imagine, for example, if some of these pagers were being used by passengers on crowded buses, on airplanes potentially, and so on, because what demonstrates, I think, the indiscriminate nature of this attack is this was not booby-trapping one phone in order to seek to assassinate a particular individual. These were all simultaneously set off and under circumstances where Israel either did not know or did not care where they were, who they were with, what the risk was to surrounding civilians.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be stated. That's why I think that's why I asked the question. I mean, the only difference between this and other forms of terrorism is that it is the method of delivery. There are other methods of delivering explosives, which is clearly a terrorist act. But in terms of its aim and objective, the booby trapping of phones is exactly the same as other forms of delivering or targeting civilians, even say, for example, suicide attacks. I mean, it's an indiscriminate attack on civilians. And this is likewise the same thing. The method.
And if I could just, and I'm sure, that Israel did intend to kill as many people in Hamas's chain of command and military cadres and so on as possible. But it also seems to me indisputable that a further objective of this attack was to seek to paralyze and sow terror within Lebanon as an entirety, to make ordinary civilians cease trusting everyday civilian objects. And we've all heard these stories about children paralyzed with fear, telling their parents, don't text me back, don't use their phone, and so on. And it does have a real impact when an entire society, in the space of an instant, suddenly feels it can no longer use everyday objects like communications devices that have become essential to the conduct of our daily lives. And again, if you want to understand the severity of this, try to put it in a context where you can't use Israel's right to do anything and everything it pleases whenever it does so and be lauded for it to judge it. Had this been a Hezbollah attack in Israel, what would we then say? Had this been an Al-Qaeda attack in Europe, would we still be lauding it for its technical ingenuity? I don't think so.
And there is another aspect to this attack which has been completely ignored by the mainstream media, which is that this could, in the long term, really affect Israel in a negative way. And the lesson to take away from this is that Israeli technology and hardware and software cannot be trusted. That is a lesson many will draw. And I'm thinking of countries that buy Israeli tech, for example, in the Gulf. Surely they will need to review the supply chain and make sure that these electronic devices have not been booby-trapped in the same way, because who knows, in 5 years' time, the UAE, Saudi, or any of the other countries that have normalized relations may one day be, Israel may see them as an enemy, and who knows what could happen. So not just the Gulf countries, many other countries who purchase electronic devices from Israel will need to really review the supply chains and think of purchasing Israeli hardware. So in the long term, this could really impact Israel economically and boost the BDS, for example.
You would think so, but given the way, again, we're approaching this rationally, and so that would be kind of the logical conclusion to draw. But this is Israel. Special considerations are always given to terrorism and these kinds of things when it's Israel that's doing it. And I don't expect that there will be consequences, because Israeli impunity remains a sacred principle, a foundational principle of international law as practiced by the West. And they would rather see these fundamental principles of international law incinerated rather than ensure that they're also applied to Israel. It's unfortunately really that simple.
As I said at the beginning, this is an ongoing, the story is an ongoing development, and I'm sure we'll return to it next week in our review. Let's turn our attention to two other stories before we end. The first is the West Bank, where Israel has closed the office of Al Jazeera and banned its journalists from reporting. So just let's talk about that for a minute. Why now? I mean, of course, Israel has closed prevented Al Jazeera, not just Al Jazeera, all news agencies from covering Gaza, but Al Jazeera specifically has been a target, not just of Israel, but also of the US. We think of Afghanistan and Iraq, where the Americans also bombed Al Jazeera offices. So let's talk a bit about that and your response to the closing of Al Jazeera office in the West Bank.
Well, I think we should see this in several contexts, if you will. First, I think we need to understand that Israel has a long history of suppressing the press. So, to give one example, there used to be a Palestinian weekly newspaper called Al Fajr, and Israel applied strict military censorship, as it has since the moment it was established, but it applies it particularly in the occupied territories. And so if, in the 70s or 80s, if you would pick up a copy of Al Fajr, an English language Palestinian weekly, there would be a box where it would indicate, how many articles had been rejected for publication by the censor, how many had been amended by the military censor, and so on. Then all of a sudden, that column, if you will, disappeared. Why? Because a military censor had decided to censor Al Fajr's editors from reporting on the censorship of their newspaper. So you wouldn't even know that you were reading a publication that had come into your hands only because it had been approved by the military censor. And the Palestinian media is, of course, always the weakest link here in terms of Israel's repressive measures. But it has also affected international media. So, for example, in the late 1980s, during the first Intifada, two foreign journalists, both of them British actually, Andrew Whitley of the Financial Times and Ian Black of The Guardian, had their press credentials revoked because they had reported on Israel's deployment of death squads in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to eliminate activists during the first Intifada. And there are other examples. But so the first point I wanted to make is, that censorship and repressive measures against the media is a tradition, an Israeli tradition that's even older than genocide. And so this is nothing new. Secondly, I think we need to place it also in the context of the current crisis, where as media freedom agencies, press freedom organizations have repeatedly noted, more journalists have been killed since the 7th of October last year in the Gaza Strip than in any other armed conflict on record. And so I think it's demonstrably the case that Israel has adopted a policy of shoot the messenger to suppress bad news. That is why foreign media have been systematically prohibited from entering the Gaza Strip for a year now, and can only occasionally enter if they're accompanied by an Israeli military escort, embedded. So there's that context, and the Israeli military censor has been working overtime, including against the Israeli media since the 7th of October. And then I think we also need to see this in the context, two other contexts. The first is Israel's campaign of vilification against Al Jazeera, the smearing of its correspondents and so on, which has really reached unprecedented heights. And of course, find echoes among Israel's flunkies and apologists worldwide who are constantly, it's similar to the campaign against UNRWA. If a humanitarian agency is a terrorist organization, well, then surely one of the world's leading global media institutions can be a terrorist institution as well. And you've seen similar Israeli campaigns against its best friends in the media, like the BBC, CNN, the New York Times, and so on, because Israel has now reached the stage where unless you're 110% with Israel, you're treated as an enemy. 99.99% loyalty is insufficient. And if you fall even 1 percentage point short, you're not a very loyal friend. You're an enemy and will be treated as such. But in the case of Al Jazeera, of course, it's been going on for years, and in the course of the past year, in May, Israel passed legislation essentially declaring Al Jazeera a threat to national security. It banned it from working within Israel or in annexed East Jerusalem. And what it has done now is it has shut down Al Jazeera's operations in the West Bank. And you said, why now? Well, it's a very good question because Israel's repression and campaign of violence against the Palestinians in the West Bank has this year reached heights unprecedented since the Second Intifada. And there are growing fears that part of the reason that Israel is seeking to suppress the media from operating in the West Bank is because it may have drastic measures in mind to implement should there indeed, for example, be a regional war where all our focus is diverted not to the Gaza Strip, but to things happening in Lebanon or perhaps elsewhere, and under cover of that Israel may take extreme or even more extreme measures rather against the Palestinians in the West Bank.
And let's end with last Wednesday's UN General Assembly resolution calling for an end to Israeli occupation within 12 months. I don't know why they put 12 months. Israel has been occupying for the West Bank since 1967. What would change in 12 months? Who's going to enforce that? So let's retrace how we got there, the implications of the ICJ ruling a few weeks ago, declaring Israel's occupation as being illegal. But also just generally, I mean, I looked at the UK's response to why it abstained, and it sent out a really confusing statement as to why it abstained. Of course, first of all, we just stress, Israel's behavior and the genocidal campaign in Gaza has made it extremely difficult for its allies to support Israel, but they nevertheless still do. And when they do support Israel, offer assistance in the form of abstaining in the UN General Assembly. They sent out really confusing statements, like, for example, the UK, who said that, we support the UN resolution, but we hope that this would be settled through some kind of a negotiated process between the two parties. I mean, same old narrative the UK repeated. But does this now not completely take away? Remove the carpet from under the feet of the UK and other countries who maintain this narrative? The start of negotiation now is simply Israel has to first withdraw, end its occupation within the next 12 months, then we can start negotiation. This idea that the two parties should simply negotiate their way out of this occupation and end this ethnic cleansing, we should simply do away with this narrative now, because with the ICJ declaring the occupation to be illegal and the UN resolution now saying that it should end within 12 months, doesn't that mean first we need to end Israel's occupation, end its ethnic cleansing, then we can discuss negotiation? So again, the UK is putting the cart before the horse and sent out a really confusing statement from what happened on Wednesday.
Imagine there's a bank robbery and the court intervenes to tell the police that they can't stop this robbery or arrest the robbers because there first have to be negotiations to determine if and how much of the loot the robbers can leave the bank with. That's basically what's happening here. Regarding this General Assembly resolution, I think it's important to recall that the International Court of Justice's recent advisory opinion was not in response to a Palestinian petition. the court had been asked for this advisory opinion by the General Assembly with an overwhelming vote. And it was on that basis that the International Court of Justice examined this issue and issued its advisory opinion. And it is in that context that the General Assembly then considered this ruling and passed its recent resolution. I'd been told that supporters of this resolution had been expecting it to pass, but to pass with perhaps only 90 to 100 votes in favor. It in fact got 124 votes in favor, far exceeding the expectations of its supporters, just as the ICJ's advisory opinion far exceeded the hopes and expectations of Palestinians and others who were hoping it would declare the occupation illegal. Now, what the advisory opinion said, it said not only that the occupation is illegal, but also that it needs to end as rapidly as possible without putting a deadline on that, on ending it. And it is in that context that the General Assembly took up the matter and tried to put meat on those bones. Similarly, the advisory opinion made clear that third parties, that states cannot be complicit in Israel's illegal occupation. And if you look at the General Assembly resolution, many of its clauses seek to specify what states must and cannot do in their dealings with Israel to ensure that their actions promote a rapid end rather than an indefinite prolongation of the illegal occupation. And it's in that context, I think, that the resolution needs to be understood. And again, who voted against this resolution? Well, the United States and Israel, of course, and then a bunch of increasingly submerged Pacific islands and a few banana republics. So representing, I think, maybe 5% of the global population, if not less. A larger group of states, including many of those who most loudly screech about the rules-based international order and respect for international law and universal norms and values and so on, you guessed it, Europeans, abstained, including those who have made a profession out of going around the globe wagging their fingers at darker peoples about how they need to respect this and implement that. Countries like the Netherlands and so on. They all abstain because, again, international law is a sacred principle for others, but we and our friends can pretend it doesn't exist. And so others took the position that, well, we couldn't vote for this resolution because, as you said, making excuses like these things need to be negotiated, where the advisory opinion made absolutely clear this is not subject to negotiation. You don't first negotiate whether or not you have the right to steal someone else's land. You return that land. And if there's any issues you want to raise about access to it, well, then you're welcome to start negotiations, provided the other party agrees to do so. And others have said that they couldn't vote for the resolution because it went beyond the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion. Well, of course it did, because it sought to put meat on the bones of this advisory opinion by informing states of how they need to conduct themselves in order to ensure that the advisory opinion is implemented. So, this is a first step. It will be very interesting to see where it goes from here. Will the General Assembly, for example, start proposing increasingly firm measures, such as it did, for example, against the former white minority regime of Rhodesia, in the 1960s and 70s, or against South Africa? And if it does so, will it still be able to adopt resolutions with substantial majorities or not?
It is indeed the first step. It took a long while to get there because Palestinians have always been saying we should not be forced in a position to negotiate our basic human rights. And that's the position you start from. You end the ethnic cleansing and occupation, and then we start negotiation. We don't negotiate from the point of subjugation, colonization, occupation, but it's taken nearly 6 decades just to get to that position. But finally we are there, and it is the first step. Let's see how the Western Israel's allies respond to that, and of course we'll discuss that more and more in the coming weeks and months. Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, and thank you also for tuning in to our weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.